In this video, I'm going to cover the second part of industry analysis. And just to recap a bit what we covered in the last video, we said that in order to understand the industry, in order to understand how profitable an industry you have chosen is, you need to be looking at these three players here. Because these three players are the ones that are likely to erode value from your offering, from your product, from your service. And the three players are the suppliers, the competitors, and the customers. And we were saying as well in the last video that the behavior of these three players is going to be affected by the environment, by all the different factors that affect all of us. So when you're doing industry analysis, you need to be taking into account this connection. You have the environment, you have the three main players, and then you need to understand how the environment, the different environmental factors, we have a few examples there, are going to affect the behavior of these three players. So now in this video, we're going to go deeper into this. We're going to try to present a model that is going to allow us to understand better the behavior of these three players. So in order to understand the role of these three players that we have mentioned before and how they can actually prevent you from making or creating as much value as you can from your product, we're going to be using this model here called the Porter's 5 Forces of Competition. Okay, so this was designed by Michael Porter, which is one of the main strategist scholars out there. So this model is very, very useful. Why? Because any industry is extremely complex. There is a lot of information out there, and we, in general, we don't have enough time to be looking at all the information out there. So the greatness of this model is that it allows you to simplify things, to simplify them in a way that you can put together a very strong, robust strategy. Okay? So in this framework, the idea is very simple. It's an idea that we have already covered. You have an offering, you have a product, you have a discovery, and you are offering value to certain customers, certain people who need that solution, that offering, that product that you have. So for you, in order to return capital, to return value to those who invest their time or their money into your company, you need to be looking at how much value you can extract from each of those three players we identified before: the suppliers, the customers, and your competitors. Okay? So, and that is all going to be determined by the box we have here in the middle. And it's about how fierce, how intense the competition is in your industry. So the more intense the competition is, the more difficult for you it's going to be to extract value from your product. So now this model, what it says is that the level of competition in an industry is determined by these 4 forces around it. So the first one is your suppliers. So those who actually supply with the material that you need in order to develop your product. Okay? So if you are producing Coca-Cola, for example, one of your suppliers would be those who supply with aluminum to make the cans of Coke. Okay? But then you have as well your buyers at the bottom, who are the people who actually buy the can of Coke, okay, or the Coke in general. Then you have the potential entrants, meaning those who can actually enter your industry, those other companies that have a similar product and can actually enter your industry. They are not there yet, but they might enter your industry and therefore take away some of the customers from you. And then you have your substitutes, which is your product. How likely is your product to be substituted by something else? And what is that something else? What other products can be a substitute for what you are offering? So by looking at these 4 forces, we can determine how intense competition is in your industry, and therefore how much money, how much value you can extract from your offering, from your product. Now we're going to go into each of these 4 more in detail. Let's start with the threat of substitutes. And what is this? What is the threat of substitutes? The threat of substitutes is how likely is your product to be replaced by another one? What is the propensity of your customers to switch to another product? For example, when we talk about the graphene, the material, this material that has some amazing properties, they are a threat to existing products. So, for example, they conduct electricity much better. They are more resistant to heat as well. Therefore, they're going to substitute, or there is a threat to substitute the material that currently other companies use to produce microprocessors, for example, or to produce the casing of a computer. So that is a threat of substitute. Why? Because you're going to come in with a product, in this case graphene, that is actually has a better performance, and the price is probably around the same, if not cheaper. So that's what we have here in the second point. So the first thing is that in a context like that, where you have this material, existing companies who are your customers are more likely to switch to your new product. Why? Because the relationship between the price and the performance is better. Your performance, the performance of graphene, is much better than the performance of existing materials. And the price is about the same, if not cheaper. Meaning that customers are going to have it easy. They're going to substitute the product, the material they're using now to build microprocessors, for example, they're going to substitute that with a new material, in this case, with graphene. So in other contexts, substitution is a bit more difficult, okay? So for example, you can think about petrol, okay? At the moment, when it comes to the airline industry, a big customer that actually buy a lot of petrol, is there a threat of substitute? Is there any other substance that can be used to power planes at the moment? Well, at the moment that is non-existent. At the moment, planes can only fly realistically with petrol. But in the future, it might happen. In the future, there might be hydrogen planes, or there might be electric planes. At the moment, it's not possible. The technology is not there. So the threat of substitute in the short, medium term, in the petrol industry, connected to the industry of the airline industry, is very low. The threat is very low. So for any product, you can make this analysis. What other alternatives do we have to the product I'm offering? Okay? How likely are customers to substitute my product with a product that others are offering? Or the other way around. If you are the one entering the industry, how likely are existing customers to drop the material they're offering, the product they're using, for mine? Okay, and then in order to make the calculation, you need to think about what is the relationship between the performance of my product and what they have to pay, and the performance of the substitute products and what they have to pay for it. Is it much better? Do they get a better value for the same amount of money or even less? So that will allow you to understand how likely, how easy is it to substitute existing products in the industry you're looking into. But not always having a good substitute, a substitute that has a better relationship between value and the price you're charging, even if you have a product like that, it still can be quite difficult to enter an industry, because there might be other factors that might make it very difficult for you to enter that industry, even if you have a product, a substitute, that is actually better than the actual offering that there is now in the industry. And that's why we need to talk as well about threat of new entry. So how easy or difficult is it to enter the industry in question you're looking at? And here on the right, we have two extreme examples. At the top, we have industries that are very difficult to enter. It's very difficult to enter and compete in those industries. So for example, the airline industry or the aircraft industry, building planes, that is an industry that is very difficult to enter. Why? because making planes is extremely expensive. You need a lot of capital to enter that industry. But on the other hand, entering, let's say, the brewery industry that you have at the bottom is a lot easier. Why? Because it doesn't require, among other reasons, it doesn't require a lot of money to open your own brewery. And we have a really good example here. We can see numbers here for example, in the UK, just in the UK, between 1919 and 2014, the number of breweries went from 241 to 1,285. And the reason is because it's just very easy. So we have two extremes here, okay? The first one is very difficult to enter. Therefore, in the aircraft industry, there are only two major players here, two companies that actually make planes, because it's extremely difficult to enter. So the threat of new entry is very low. But on the other hand, if you own a brewery in Ireland, then the threat of entry is very, very high, because anybody can set up, or it's a lot easier to set up your own brewery. Okay? So what is going to determine the level of threat of new entry? So here we have a few factors that you need to take into account when you're assessing the level of threat of new entry. Okay? The first one, we already mentioned it, is capital requirements. Some industries, like the aircraft industry, requires way more capital. I have here in that little text here on the top box, I have an example. Just to produce, okay? Just to produce and develop one plane, Airbus plane, it's around $18 billion, okay? Which means that in order to break even, in order to cover for that investment, for the $18 billion, you need to sell around 400 planes, okay? Which actually brings us to the next point, economies of scale. In order for you to return the investment you're putting into designing and producing a type of plane, you need the capability, the ability to sell 400 planes. So a new company coming into this industry, would have to sell at least 400 planes before they make a profit. And that is a massive leap for any new company. You would